Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade, where now the tide will finally begin to turn back in the Imperium's favor yet again, even though no sign of that turn appears to be visible to any of the Imperium's generals, its officers, or even the War Master himself, who would describe these days as the darkest in the history of the Sabbat World's Crusade. The War Master's armies were still bashing their heads in against the Cabal system, and the Chaos Magister's terror tactics were proving effective, entire worlds surrendering without so much as a shot being fired, populations preferring to throw themselves on the tender mercies of the Chaos Invaders rather than face the inevitable terror of meeting them in battle. Even the usually steady morale and organization of the Imperial Guard and Navy were being sorely tested. Even after the sweeping reorganizations initiated by Makaroth, many of the generals now holding off the brunt of Chaos's counter-assault were doing so with thrown-together forces, mismatched battle groups gathered from whatever resources were available to their fronts. This led to problems, both on the battlefield and on a wider strategic level, with one of the most unfortunate one of these issues coming into full brutal illumination with the Adolrata incident. An Imperial Navy reinforcement fleet were rushing to the aid of a world expected to soon be assaulted by Chaos forces. But due to poor communication and fear already beginning to spread amongst the worlds under attack, the local defenders were not aware of when the Imperial reinforcements would arrive, where they would arrive from, or even if they would arrive at all. And so when they detected ships approaching their world, they panicked and opened fire. The Imperial reinforcements, assuming the planet to have already fallen to a blitzing Chaos invasion, returned the fire, destroying several defensive stations in orbit. When the misunderstanding was finally realized and clarified, both Navy reinforcements and planetary defenses, despite valiant efforts, were unable to put up more than token resistance against the arch-enemy invaders. Now, fortunately for the Imperial Crusade, most of the second and third line commanders were veterans, having been relegated to what at the time appeared to be mere reservist positions due to War Master Makaroth's preference of elevating his own men to command positions in the vital front line. These commanders' steady nerve and experience no doubt did much to avoid a general collapse as the Chaos trap began to close its jaws around the Crusade's neck, and bought the War Master vital time to come to a conclusion. He would not withdraw, he would continue the assault upon the Cabal worlds and the fortress planets within it, hoping to break through and thus forcing Chaos to call off its counterattack in order to defend its own heartland. It was, the War Master himself said, at best a 50-50 gamble, and he was going to need a miracle to pull it off. Fortunately for the Crusade, the God Emperor was listening. But even God-given miracles do not appear out of thin air, and the one that would save the Imperial Crusade began in a most unexpected place: the planet Aexe Cardinal. A studiously unimportant world in the grand scheme of things. When the Imperial Crusade had reached it, they had simply continued on to the far more important Khan IV, and opening the direct route towards the Cabal system. And this wasn't the first time the Aexe Cardinal had been simply bypassed. After the fall of Imperial governance in the Sabbat worlds and the rise of Archon Nanzibar, he too had simply passed the planet by in his rush to establish his defensive barrier to block any potential Imperial reconquests of the Sabbat worlds. Aexe Cardinal appeared to be of little strategic importance to either side. That was until it found itself as one of but a handful of worlds holding open Makaroth's jugular. And that was a very big problem, because Aexe Cardinal's primary noteworthy feature was its weakness. For despite being largely ignored by the greater galaxy, it was no placid paradise world. Instead, it had been embroiled in a 40 years long war. Not against chaos, not against some tyrannical alien invader or mutants or anything fancy, but against itself. A civil war. Aexegarian against Aexegarian for 4 decades. The planet had been exhausted after 10 years of war, and had been running on the fumes of fumes for the last 30. The planet was barely alive. If so much as a Chaos frigate appeared in the skies, it would probably collapse virtually overnight. And so it was now, all of a sudden, of paramount importance that the Imperial Crusade dispatch whatever it could to Aexe Cardinal to end this war and fortify the planet, well, yesterday, honestly. Before Chaos too recognized the weakness on the Imperium's flank. On the bright side, the world was still majoritively controlled by the Imperium via the Aexe Alliance. It was an alliance of the majority of the major nations on the world that had been locked for the last 40 years in a war against the nation of Shadik. Now, I'm sure most of you probably already know this, but it is actually quite common for Imperial worlds to be divided into many, many smaller nations. Occasionally dozens, occasionally not even nations, but hundreds, if not thousands of tribes. All of whom, whether they be nations or clans or tribes or whatever, then swear fealty to a single planetary governor, who in turn swear fealty to the Imperium. And so long as the world offers up the Imperial tithe, as the Golden Throne expects, then by and large, the Imperium is a very hands-off ruler. If the population of a world wishes to slaughter one another in a 40-year-long civil war, then, well, that is none of the Imperium's concern. Not that the Imperium could have done anything to intervene anyway on Aexe Cardinal, what with, the collapse of Imperial governance in the Sabbat worlds and so on. But now the stability of Aexe Cardinal was most assuredly of interest to the Imperium, and Barthol van Voits was dispatched with his army to bring it to complete compliance. This, at least, promised to be relatively easy. Aexe Cardinal was not a forge world, it was not a hive world, it was not a major planet in any way, which is why it kept being bypassed all the time. It was a very early industrialized planet. Its weapons were simple, semi-automatic magazine-fed solid slug rifles, crude aircraft, and extremely simplistic tanks. One of the Aexegarian army's main arms was still cavalry, mounted on curious, tall, local warbirds. And so the upstart rebel nation of Shaddiq was expected to be no challenge at all to a proper Imperial intervention force. But the Crusade was a pinch overstretched at the moment, and so it was decided that the Imperium would rely, wherever possible, on the locals for aid. After all, they had been fighting this war for 40 years, so surely they had something semi-useful to offer, right? One would think so. The Imperium reached out to the ruler, or the chief politician of the Aexe Alliance, High Zazar Leonid Thep Kreful, who was overjoyed at hearing that the Imperium would finally be arriving to assist him in winning this seemingly unending war. The Imperium would of course also need a liaison with local forces. This would be Count Jako Bosur Fep Golke. He had served in the role as Supreme Commander of the Aexe Alliance for several years, and had achieved some of the more remarkable military successes in that period, including a whole 310 meters advance at the cost of a mere 1,200 men. Yeah. Anywho, Count Jako had failed to produce the long-longed-for breakthrough, just like the guy before him, and like the guy before him, and the guy before him, and the 72 other people before him. And now he would become liaison with the Imperium instead, a nice way to shunt him out of the way. Opening the position as Supreme Commander of the Alliance forces to new blood, Lintor Sewek, a man of considerably more unbalanced temper than the Count, a man that promised action, that promised breakthroughs and victories, just like the guy before him and the guy before him, and you see where this is going. But with the Imperium on side, he might actually succeed. In fact, spirits were quite buoyant, the likes of which they had not been for very, very many years, as the Imperium's intervention appeared to be promising a swift resolution to this 40-year-long conflict. Not everyone, however, were equally optimistic. One of those was a favored Colonel Commissar in Barthol van Voigt's retinue, Ibrahim Gaunt and his Tarnith first and only. Gaunt figured that protracted, siege-style trench warfare might not be the ideal environment for his stealth-focused Tarnith first and only. He thought, in fact, that that might be a really bad idea, and so he dispatched his chief of scouts, McCall, to see the front line. He headed towards one of the busiest areas of the front line, the Painfork line. It was just in the middle of a preparatory bombardment for an attack upon the Shaddiq front lines when he arrived, to see truly enormous trenches. We are talking kilometers upon kilometers of trenches, of reserve trenches, of fallback trenches. Even the tanks have their own trench, with pre-prepared firing positions for artillery, IFVs, all kinds of armored vehicles. Most of the trenches themselves were permacrete, equipped with deep, shell-proof bunkers, inside of which the troops could shelter from even the most ferocious bombardment. The trench lines even had their own dedicated shield generators. I remind you, these things are normally reserved for hives, cities, and yet apparently this somewhat backwater world had managed to gather up enough of them to cover an entire trench front line of God only knows how many hundreds of kilometers. I feel like the shield technology in this particular part of the 40k universe is a little bit out of whack, but here we are. Surely, nothing can threaten such a monstrous fortification, right? Well, on this day, the shields were being brought down for, as mentioned, a preparatory bombardment against the Shaddiq front lines, which would be followed up by probing assaults up and down the lines. A 20-kilometer wide barrage would be launched, then the troops would go over the top and see what kind of nonsense they could get up to. But the barrage had barely started before it was interrupted by enemy counter-battery fire. Now, this in and of itself wasn't necessarily all of that unusual, although Shaddiq had been pushed to the absolute breaking point. They didn't have a whole lot of artillery left, not a whole lot of heavy pieces, certainly nothing to contest a 20 kilometers preparatory bombardment. But this was no normal counter-battery barrage, as the Painfolk line came under fire from what was quickly deemed to be enemy super-heavy siege guns. The bombardment of these behemoth weapons quickly began to break up the consistency of the Aexegarian alliance bombardment. The guns began to falter as they were taking a punishing barrage the likes of which they, or anyone in the trenches, or even McCall, a veteran of Vervanhive, had never seen before. And that wasn't the end of the surprises either, as Shaddiq raiders broke upon the front lines mere moments thereafter. This too was rather unusual. The norm in this static war was still hour-long bombardments, followed by massive waves of troops marching stolidly across no man's land. This, however, was an infiltration assault, led by clearly well-trained enemy stormtroopers carrying an absolute assload of grenades, and even a handful of very rare automatic weapons, as the standard on both sides of the war were magazined bolt-action rifles. McCall had come for a simple reconnaissance mission, and he was about to get involved in something significantly more complicated. But, on the bright side, he got to demonstrate the superiority of Imperial technology, as a las rifle carries a few hundred rounds in its magazine, and is plenty capable of fully automatic fire, very much so a rarity in this conflict. Him and his small detachment of scouts helped deny the enemy raiders' assault on their section of the trenches in this part of the Painfolk line, although several others were overrun and would remain contested for hours thereafter. But that wasn't really all that big of a deal. The front line had been wandering back and forth, God only knows how many thousands of times, in the 40-year-long war. What was discomforting was the presence of enemy super-heavy pieces that they could not conceivably have created themselves. Shaddiq could barely make field pieces or mortars anymore. It seemed impossible that they could have crafted these railway pieces with a range in excess of 20 to 30 kilometers. In fact, the majority of the Cardinal and even the Imperial rocket-assisted artillery rounds were helpless against them. They simply couldn't reach the enemy guns. Something weird was going on here. And weirder and more uncomfortable still it was going to get. First and foremost for Ibrahim Gaunt, as he did, as he usually does, get on the wrong side of the local chain of command. I swear to God. Gaunt could make enemies out of guide dogs. He could go to a kindergarten and come home with 3 new arch nemesis. In this case, he was objecting over the agreement that the Imperial Guard had made with the Aexegarian alliance. For you see, the Alliance had been eager to make sure that they retained command of the war. They would be providing the majority of the manpower. They'd already been fighting for 40 years, and they weren't about to give over command of a front that the Imperium, fair enough, had no understanding of, to a bunch of outsiders who hadn't even been on the planet for 5 minutes. The War Master himself had agreed to this when he had dispatched Imperial Guard reinforcements. The Imperial Guard were to be an allied force, auxiliary troops. They were not there to seize command from the Aexegarians. This meant that, by definition, Imperial Guard officers were always subordinate to local Aexegarian command. This placed Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt under the command of an Alliance Major. Something Gaunt immediately became very upset about, and so he decided to do what Gaunt all too often does, and make up his own rules. You see, the Tarnith First and Only had been assigned a section of the front line. The Aexe Alliance was overstretched. It needed manpower first and foremost. It needed the ability to relieve its own units and mass for further offensives. Thus, since the Imperial Guard had no idea what they were actually doing here, it made far more sense to slot them into relatively quiet sectors, relieving Aexegarian units so that they may be used in future offensives. Gaunt disagreed, and so he immediately sent requests to be excused from frontline duty, and to have the Tarnith First and Only be brought back into the reserves, where their skills as scouts and infiltrators could be better used in the future. Now, there is absolutely a point here, no doubt about it, but, well, this is a trench war. It's a siege war. The value of scouting is frankly somewhat limited when you've known where the enemy is for the last 30-odd years. And Gaunt didn't really manage to make a good enough argument to the Aexe Alliance commanders. That would fall to somebody else later on. Gaunt, therefore, reluctantly took up his position in the front line, the 55th sector. But instead of ordering the Tarnith First and Only to fully occupy his assigned sector, he only sent 1/3 of his regiment to actually occupy the trenches, along with Aexegarian personnel who would man the various squad support weapons that were already installed in the front line, such as bomb throwers. Meanwhile, the other 2/3 of his regiments would be placed in deep reserves, in rest and relaxation positions, and in reserves for the front line. He wanted to rotate these out. 1/3 would be in the front for a week, then be rotated out for 2, and so on. This was not a system that the Aexegarians maintained themselves. They instead rotated large formations, entire divisions in and out of the front line on a basis determined mainly by the intensity of the fighting, rather than their desire to rest their troops. Obviously, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt knew better, and hey, it did almost lead to the greatest breakthrough of the front line achieved in the last few decades. In the wrong direction, mind you, but still, a breakthrough's a breakthrough, even if it's the enemies. As Shadiq launched a major offensive alongside a huge segment of the front line. And in Sector 55, the Tarnith First and Only were very nearly overrun as, well, their trenches were enormously undermanned. And hey, you know what? I retract my previous point about scouting not being that necessary in this kind of static warfare, because if Shadiq had sent forward adequate scouts and realized that they were sat opposite a bunch of happy, naive trench warfare amateurs who had placed 1/3 of a regiment in the front lines, well, they would probably have succeeded in a mass breakthrough right then and there, as the Tarnith reserves would have been forced to assault their own trench lines in the face of massed enemy battery fire, including things like super heavy guns. Luckily for Gaunt, His men's enormous technological superiority in being possessed of weapons about, 2,000 years more advanced than his opposition, and the admitted fighting excellence and stubbornness of the Tarnith prevented what should by all rights have been a sweeping breakthrough advance from the Shaddiq forces. And in Gaunt's defense, he wasn't the only commander to almost lose his trench section that day, as Shaddiq launched a massive escalation all along this part of the front, along with heavy bombardments from both conventional and the new super heavy guns, and armored assaults as well. More and more, it was becoming very obvious that Shaddiq was not the enemy that the Aexe Alliance had been fighting for the last few decades. Something had changed. They were receiving off-world help as well. Exactly what kind of help was as of yet unclear, but these guns had not materialized out of nowhere, nor had masses of primitive yet still effective armor, and certainly the Shaddiq Alliance was expected to be nearing the end of its resources, yet here it was, launching mass assaults on a scale rarely before seen. Something was going to have to change with the Aexe Alliance as well, and a meeting for many of the commanders was called soon thereafter, where Gaunt encountered a strange phenomenon where he found a small chapel along the road. There shouldn't have been a chapel there, and inside was a woman, a sororitas by the name of Eleanor Zakir. She told Gaunt some intriguing hints about the future, about the arrival of a certain miracle, and gave him a warning as well, that he was going to have to make sure that the miracle could actually happen. A whole bunch of cryptic nonsense, but somewhat difficult to dismiss when the car that Gaunt borrowed from this mysterious old woman in the woods just kind of disappeared later that night, along with the keys and any sign that there had ever been a chapel or a sororita serving it in that location. Suspicious indeed. Fortunately for Gaunt, he did get something more worthwhile out of the evening with the Alliance High Command. It was agreed that half of the Tarnith First and Only would be pulled off the front line and assigned to the Montauk Forest, where they would scout it out in the case of a major enemy attempt to move around the dedicated front line and through this presumed impassable terrain. This was largely due to the efforts of Count Golker, who had talked up the Tarnith First and Only's reputation as scouts and infiltrators, and the best way to play to their strength was to send them into a territory that the Alliance considered to be impassable. War had changed, he would say. Perhaps what we consider to be and not to be impassable has changed as well. However, it did come with a cost. Gaunt had managed to piss off yet further members of the Aexe Alliance upper echelons of commanders, and this saw the other half of his regiment be assigned to the Saber Pocket, one of the most fiercely contested areas of land in the entire war, where the Tarnith were asked to infiltrate the enemy's defenses, perhaps locate and destroy these new super heavy siege guns. After all, if they were so good at this covert nonsense, this should prove an easy enough task, right? Right. But hey, it was better than nothing. Half of his regiment would be taken off the meat grinder of the front line, and that was enough for Gaunt, who would take command, of course, of the units headed to the trenches. I rag on Gaunt quite a bit because his mouth gets him into a lot of trouble, largely because Ibrahim Gaunt is quite convinced that he always knows best, even when he has absolutely no experience with what he's dealing with. But He is undoubtedly a brave, resolute, and, by Imperial Commissar standards, fair commander. And he possessed that most unique, most valuable, and sought after of all military traits: luck. The man was very, very, very lucky. And once again, his luck would come to the benefit of the Imperium. Half of the Tarnith First and Only that had been deployed into the Montauk Forest, alongside light and some medium to heavy armored support in the Crassian Armored Regiment, ran head first into a blood-packed formation heading in the opposite direction. Just as Imperial officers had noted the potential weakness of the Montauk Forest, if only large enough formations could be pushed through its dense undergrowth, the Chaos commanders had noticed the same thing. An offensive coming out of the Montauk Forest would bypass all of the previously established defensive positions, and might drive deep into the enemy's heartland within a month or so. This was true for both sides. It was a small party under the command of Major Rawn's adjutant, Merton Fagor, that first encountered the Blood Pact. His group had been, recuperating in a small homestead that they had discovered deep in the Montauk Forest. It was this homestead that would be the first scene of a confrontation between Blood Pact and Imperial forces on Aexe Cardinal, with the Imperials barely surviving after having sent one of their scouts in training, Yayo, running back to find the rest of the Tarnith First and Only, before leading them and elements of the Crassian Armored towards the homestead. Arriving in time to save Fagor and a few of his men, although their casualties had been severe, including yet another reminder that mercy is a weakness in the Imperial Guard, provided by our very own Elijah Chu, who also, of course, survived the encounter. But the Blood Pact presence had now been revealed, and their own light armor was swiftly swept aside by the Crassians, who secured a solid foothold for future Imperial exploitation of the Montauk Forest, and with the presence not just of Shadik forces but of Blood Pact troops, this exploitation would be coming sooner rather than later. It would allow the Alliance to launch a proper sidestepping offensive against the Shadik lines and their newfound allies. This good news also came similarly with the destruction of the super heavy siege guns, as the other half of the Tarnith First and Only had not been sitting idly by either. Eager to put his mark on the conflict, the new Alliance Supreme Commander, Lintor Sewek, had organized and launched a major offensive operation across several sectors of the established front line, with the main maneuver being launched from the Painfork line. The intent of it was to create the first proper breakthrough in 20-odd years, securing a new front line dozens of kilometers past the Painfork line. This was a optimistic fantasy that many Allied commanders had had before Lintor Sewek, but Lintor was convinced that he would be the last Supreme Commander to have it, and he might just be proven correct as well. As Alliance assault teams went over the top and, in most areas, had limited success at best, seizing one or two lines of trenches before being brought to a screeching halt with devastating casualties, it did provide the Tarnith First and Only with cover for their own infiltration operations. Deployed alongside Alliance assault elements, and with Imperial armor launching further diversionary assaults to the north, the Tarnith were able to infiltrate the enemy's rearward communications and supply trenches relatively unnoticed. As unnoticed as any attempt at sneaking is going to go in, trenches. And indeed, Gaunt's own deep infiltration party got detected, attacked, and separated from all of his friends. Again, my previous objection to the need for scouting in trench warfare remains, but the infiltration tactics did have their benefits, as Gaunt's party managed to get far enough into the enemy's line to locate the siege guns. They were indeed super heavy railway artillery, and the Tarnith were able to detonate enough explosives in enemy stores to rupture their railway connection, meaning that the super heavies could not evacuate from their current firing positions. And then they were nothing more than particularly huge sitting ducks, whose locations, now known, were communicated to the Imperial Navy, who launched marauder flights to devastate them shortly thereafter. Gaunt's own infiltration party did manage to get back to their own lines, although far from unscathed, losing a fair few of their members along the way, along with Count Iako Busa Fep Golke, who had joined Gaunt and his men to learn the off-worlders' ways and tactics, in the hopes that he might better understand them and use them further in the war. Well, that wasn't going to be happening now. But due to the Montauk Forest incident, the new Allied Supreme Commander, Lintor Sewek, was far more open to listening to his Imperial Guard allies and officers. A full-scale escalation of the operations in the Montauk Forest was launched. And within the year, major Imperial Guard and Alliance elements were moving into the Shadik heartlands, though this would not be the war-winning maneuver, at the very least not yet, that many had hoped it would be. On the main front line, Lintor Sewek's offensive petered out after merely 4 days. A remarkable level of restraint, actually, seeing as many of these offensives were often carried on well beyond the hope of any actual success, simply to continue to communicate an image of strength to one's opponents. And perhaps Sewek should have continued to do so, as Shadik apparently saw this as indeed weakness. Their off-world allies' efforts in the Montauk forests had been thwarted, and their super-heavy siege guns had been robbed from them as well. But Shadik was not done yet. In response to the Painfork Line offensive, they launched their own titanic counter-thrusts, which cut deep into the Alliance front lines. A final major marshalling of all of Shadik's strength that came dangerously close to exhausting what remained of the Alliance's manpower. But now realizing that this was a far more dangerous situation than originally estimated, further Imperial Guard forces would be dedicated to the war at a rapid clip. And as for the Blood Pact elements, well, they must have arrived at some point secretively before the Alliance received their own Imperial relief force, meaning that they must be some forward scouting elements, hoping to take rapid advantage of the planet's weakness to win a quick victory, after which Chaos could have reinforced and fortified the world at their leisure. But having arrived in lesser numbers and at roughly the same time as the Imperials, they were not able to gain a decisive advantage early enough to build upon it. And since no further Chaos reinforcements were dispatched, in all due likelihood, the warlords had given up on an easy win on Aexe Cardinal, presuming instead that even if the planet fell into Imperial hands, well, so what? So what really? The world was exhausted. It would provide precious few new regiments to Makaroth's crusade, and would in fact instead divert several regiments to finish the war, which would still grind on for a few more years, as Shadik, now having been proven to be corrupted by chaos, would be given no mercy and no quarter. this was no longer a war between mere nations, but a war on a galactic scale, where the only answer to one's enemy was extermination. But the Colonel Commissar and his Tarnith First and Only would not be there to see it. They had instead been given hurried new orders to take the regiment off the line and evacuate them into space, where they would be rerouted to meet an old friend, Lord General Lugo, who had so very nearly overseen the final mission of Colonel Commissar Gaunt when he was dispatched to the Shrine Hold to recover the remnants of Saint Sabbat. Lugo had fallen quite far out of favor after that, but he'd found a way back into relevance. Lord General Lugo had relocated his headquarters staff to the world of Herodor, alongside Saintess Sabbat herself, who had apparently returned from the dead to lead the Imperial Crusade yet again. Here, then, was the miracle that Gaunt had been warned of by the long-dead Sister of Battle, and the miracle that might yet save the Imperial Crusade. Even if this returned saint, a hoax as far as Ibrahim Gaunt was concerned, proved to indeed be false, she would be a fine banner around which to rally flagging Imperial morale. And Gaunt himself did feel a certain connection to the saint, what with all of the weird happenstances that had occurred in his life, and this new fake saint had requested his regiment and him himself by name. Yet again, something weird was going on here. But orders were orders, and for once Gaunt was not in a mind to reinterpret them. And so the Tarnith were dispatched to Herodor to engage in perhaps their single most important action ever. But that will have to be a story for next week. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.